What if everything you know about biblical giants is wrong? Most Christians think Goliath was just one big guy with a slingshot problem. But here's the truth that will shock you. The Bible mentions giants 30 times. 30. And most of them weren't just tall people. They were something far more terrifying. The Hebrew doesn't say giant, it says Nephilim, the fallen ones. Gibborim, mighty destroyers. Rephaim, the dead ones. These weren't humans. They were something else entirely. Ancient texts describe beings 15 to 20 feet tall, warriors with 6 fingers and 6 toes, creatures so violent that God himself ordered their complete annihilation. But here's where it gets disturbing. They survived. The flood was supposed to kill them all, every single one. Yet when Moses sent spies into the promised land, they came back terrified, saying, "We saw the Nephilim there. We felt like grasshoppers." How is that possible? How do you survive God's judgment? And here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. Jesus said the end times would be as it was in the days of Noah. If giants defined Noah's time, what does that mean for ours? Modern genetic research is unlocking secrets that sound like science fiction. Archaeological discoveries are being hidden from the public. Ancient bloodlines that should be extinct might be stirring again. Hit subscribe if you're ready for the truth, because what we're about to uncover will change everything you thought you knew about the Bible. The giants are coming back, and this time, they're not just in ancient history. Chapter 2. Before the Flood. The Nephilim Origin Story. Genesis chapter 6 contains one of the most mysterious and controversial passages in the entire Bible. Most Christians have read these verses dozens of times, but few understand the shocking implications of what Moses actually wrote. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Who were these sons of God? This question has divided biblical scholars for centuries, and the answer determines how we understand everything that follows in Scripture. Some theologians argue these were the descendants of Seth, Adam's righteous son. They claim this passage simply describes godly men marrying ungodly women, resulting in spiritual corruption. This interpretation sounds safe and comfortable, but it doesn't match what the Hebrew text actually says. The Hebrew phrase, B'nai ha-Elohim, sons of God, appears only a few times in the Old Testament. In Job chapters 1 and 2, this exact phrase refers to angels who present themselves before God's throne. In Job 38:7, the sons of God are present at earth's creation, singing and rejoicing as God lays the foundations of the world. If these sons of God were simply human descendants of Seth, why would the Bible use such specific angelic language? And why would their marriages with human women produce such extraordinary offspring? The text continues. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The word Nephilim comes from the Hebrew root nephal, which means to fall violently. These weren't heroes in the way we think of heroes today. The Hebrew word translated as heroes is Gibborim, which means mighty warriors or champions, but the context suggests these were champions of violence and corruption, not righteousness. Ancient Jewish texts that existed during Jesus' time provide more details about this event. The Book of Enoch, which Jude quotes in the New Testament, describes these sons of God as fallen angels who abandoned their heavenly positions to pursue human women. According to Enoch, these fallen angels taught humans forbidden knowledge. They revealed secrets of warfare, showing people how to make swords and shields. They taught women how to use cosmetics and jewelry for seduction. They shared knowledge of astrology and divination, leading people away from dependence on God. But the most disturbing part was their offspring. These angel-human hybrids grew to enormous sizes. Ancient texts describe some reaching heights of 300 cubits. That's over 400 feet tall, though many scholars believe this measurement was symbolic rather than literal. Even using conservative estimates, we're talking about beings 15 to 20 feet in height. These giants possessed supernatural strength and appetites. They consumed vast amounts of food, and when crops and livestock couldn't satisfy their hunger, ancient texts claim they began hunting humans for food. They became predators that terrorized the earth, but their corruption went beyond physical violence. These beings introduced genetic contamination that threatened the very bloodline through which the promised Messiah would come. If human DNA became corrupted by angelic interference, how could God's plan of salvation proceed through a human redeemer? This is why God's response was so severe. Genesis 6:5-6 records God's heartbreak. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. The Hebrew word for regretted here is nacham, which means to be sorry or to grieve deeply. God didn't make a mistake. He was grieving over what his creation had become through supernatural corruption. So God made a decision that would change history forever. He would send a flood to destroy every living thing that breathed air. Every human, every animal, every giant, every corrupt hybrid would die. Only Noah's family, whose genetics remained pure, would survive to repopulate the earth. The flood wasn't just God's judgment on human sin. It was a cosmic reset, designed to eliminate the genetic contamination that threatened his plan for humanity's redemption. But if that's true, if every Nephilim died in the flood, if every giant was destroyed, then how do we explain what happened next? How could giants reappear in the Promised Land when Moses sent spies to scout the territory? If you're finding this as fascinating as I am, go ahead and hit that like button. We're about to explore one of the greatest mysteries in all of Scripture, and trust me, you won't want to miss the shocking answer. The survival of giants after the flood raises questions that challenge our understanding of everything we've been taught about biblical history. Chapter 3: The Impossible Survival. Giants. After the flood. Imagine you're one of the 12 Israelite spies Moses sent to scout the Promised Land. You've witnessed God's incredible power firsthand. You saw him part the Red Sea. You watched fire come down from Mount Sinai. You've eaten bread that appears miraculously in the wilderness every morning. Your faith in God's mighty power should be unshakable. But then you see them. Numbers 13:32-33 records what happened. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Wait. Stop everything. Did you catch what just happened? These spies specifically identified the giants they saw as Nephilim, the same beings who were supposed to have been completely destroyed in Noah's flood. How is this possible? The flood was global. Genesis 7:21-23 makes this crystal clear. Every living thing that moved on land perished. Birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. People and animals and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. Every living thing died. Every giant perished. Every Nephilim was destroyed. So how were they back? This question has kept biblical scholars awake for centuries, and the possible answers are both fascinating and controversial. Theory number 1. The spies were simply using familiar terminology. Maybe these weren't actual Nephilim, but giants who were so similar to the pre-flood Nephilim that the spies called them by the same name. But this theory has problems. Why would trained military scouts use inaccurate terminology when reporting to Moses? These men had been chosen specifically for their reliability and attention to detail. Would they really misidentify what they saw? Theory number 2. The same supernatural event that created the original Nephilim happened again after the flood. Remember, Genesis 6:4 says the Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterward. The phrase "and also afterward" might refer to a second incursion of fallen angels after the flood. This theory suggests that some fallen angels observed what happened before the flood, learned from it, and tried again with a different strategy. Instead of creating massive giants who would be obvious targets for divine judgment, they might have created smaller but still supernatural offspring. Theory number 3, and this one is controversial. Noah's family carried giant genetics in recessive form. Genesis 6:9 says Noah was perfect in his generations, which could refer to his genealogy being free from angelic corruption. But what about his wife? What about his sons' wives? The Bible doesn't specifically state that their genetics were pure. If one of them carried recessive Nephilim genes, those traits could resurface in later generations. This might explain how giants appeared among various nations after the flood, without requiring a second angelic intervention. Theory number 4 challenges our understanding of the flood itself. Some scholars suggest the flood might have been regional rather than global, allowing some giant populations to survive in distant lands. However, This theory conflicts with the clear biblical description of worldwide destruction. But here's where it gets really interesting. The post-flood giants weren't identical to the pre-flood Nephilim. They were smaller, more diverse, and organized into distinct tribal groups rather than one unified race. The Anakim, who we'll explore in detail next, were descendants of a man named Anak, whose father was Abba. This suggests a human genealogy rather than direct angelic offspring. Yet these humans somehow possessed giant characteristics. Could it be that the original Nephilim left behind genetic material that survived the flood in some form? Could their corruption have been preserved in ways we don't fully understand? Modern genetics reveals that DNA can remain viable for thousands of years under the right conditions. We've successfully extracted genetic material from specimens that are tens of thousands of years old. If pre-flood technology was more advanced than we assume, could genetic preservation have been possible? I know this sounds like science fiction, but remember that Genesis describes the pre-flood world as having technology capable of things that nothing will be impossible for them. What if that included genetic preservation or manipulation? The truth is, we may never know exactly how giants survived the flood, but we do know they were there when Israel arrived in Canaan. We know they terrified experienced warriors, and we know they represented a direct challenge to God's plan for His chosen people. What we're about to discover about the Anakim will show you just how serious this giant problem had become. These weren't just big people. They were organized, intelligent, and determined to stop Israel from inheriting their promised land. Before we continue, let me ask you something. Are you sharing this journey with anyone? This information is too important to keep to yourself. Hit that share button and send this to someone who needs to hear these truths. Trust me, they'll thank you later. Now, let's meet the giants that made grown men feel like grasshoppers. Chapter 4. The Anakim, Terror of the Promised Land. The city of Hebron is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. Today, it's a bustling Palestinian city in the West Bank. But 3,400 years ago, it was known by a different name, Kirjath Arba, which means City of Arba. Who was Arba? According to Joshua 14:15, he was the greatest man among the Anakim. In other words, Arba was the largest giant in a race of giants. Let that sink in for a moment. If he was the biggest among people who were already enormous, how massive must this man have been? Arba built the city that became Hebron. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient Hebron had unusually large foundations, massive stone blocks, and architectural features that suggest inhabitants much larger than normal humans. The doorways, ceiling heights, and structural supports all point to a city designed for giants. But Arba wasn't just one isolated giant. He had descendants, the Anakim. The name Anakim comes from Anak, which means long-necked ones, or those who wear necklaces. Some scholars believe this refers to their unusual height, making their necks appear longer than normal humans. Others think it refers to ceremonial necklaces that marked them as a distinct people group. Numbers 13:22 gives us specific information about the Anakim clans. They saw Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak. These weren't just individual giants. They were family names representing entire clans of giant people. Each name carries specific meaning that tells us about their nature. Ahiman means brother of a gift, or my brother is a gift. Sheshai means whitish, or marble-like, possibly referring to their appearance. Talmai means bold or spirited, suggesting a warlike temperament. These weren't primitive cave dwellers. The Anakim had developed a sophisticated civilization. They built fortified cities with massive walls. They had organized military forces. They had established trade relationships with neighboring peoples. Deuteronomy chapter 9, 1-2 describes the challenge they represented. Hear, Israel, you are now about to cross the Jordan to go in and dispossess nations greater and stronger than you, with large cities that have walls up to the sky. The people are strong and tall, Anakites. You know about them and have heard it said, who can stand up against the Anakites? Who can stand up against the Anakites? Had become a common saying in the ancient world. It was like asking, who can fight Superman and win? These giants had such a fearsome reputation that their name alone struck terror into the hearts of seasoned warriors. But here's what's truly remarkable about the Israelite spies' reaction. These men had witnessed the 10 plagues in Egypt. They had seen God part the Red Sea and destroy Pharaoh's army. They had watched fire come down from heaven at Mount Sinai. They had seen God provide food and water in the wilderness through supernatural means. Yet when they encountered the Anakim, 10 of the 12 spies completely lost faith in God's ability to help them conquer the land. Numbers 13:31-33 records their exact words. But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Notice they didn't just say the Anakim were big. They said they felt like grasshoppers in comparison. A grasshopper compared to a human represents a size ratio of roughly 1 to 200. If we take this literally, it suggests the Anakim were enormous beyond our modern imagination. But only 2 spies maintained their faith, Joshua and Caleb. Numbers 14:6-9 records their response. Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." Joshua and Caleb saw the same giants the other spies saw, but instead of focusing on the size of the giants, they focused on the size of their God. This is why God condemned the faithless spies and the entire generation that believed their report to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. It wasn't just about military strategy. It was about trusting God's promises despite overwhelming circumstances. But God didn't forget about the giant problem. He had a plan to deal with the Anakim, and that plan would involve the very spies who had maintained their faith. 40 years later, when Joshua led Israel into the Promised Land, one of his first objectives was eliminating the Anakim. Joshua 11:21-22 records what happened. At that time, Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, GATH, and Ashdod did any survive. Notice that last sentence carefully. The Anakim weren't completely extinct. Some survived in 3 specific cities: Gaza, GATH, and Ashdod. These were all Philistine cities, and this detail becomes crucial for understanding what happened with Goliath centuries later. But the Anakim weren't the only giant race that survived the flood. There were others, and their story is even more mysterious and disturbing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into biblical mysteries, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. We're about to explore giant races that were connected to death itself, and what we discover might change how you understand the spiritual realm forever. Chapter 5. The Rephaim. Giants connected to death. There's something deeply unsettling about the Rephaim that sets them apart from other biblical giant races. While the Anakim were known for their size and the Nephilim for their supernatural origin, the Rephaim were associated with death, the underworld, and the realm of departed spirits. The very name Rephaim comes from the Hebrew word Rapha, which means dead ones, departed spirits, or those who have lost the power of life. This wasn't just a description of what happened to them after they died. It was their identity while they lived. Why would living giants be called the dead ones? What was it about these beings that connected them so closely to death and the spirit world? Genesis 14:5 gives us our first biblical reference to the Rephaim. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him went out and defeated the Rephites in Ashtaroth-Karnaim. This was during Abraham's time, making the Rephaim one of the oldest documented giant races in Scripture. Ashtaroth-Karnaim, where they lived, was a significant location. Archaeological evidence suggests it was a center for worship of Ashtoreth, also called Astarte, a Canaanite goddess associated with fertility, war, and the underworld. The fact that the Rephaim established themselves in a place dedicated to underworld worship isn't coincidental. But the Rephaim weren't just ancient history. They were still a major force during Israel's conquest of the Promised Land. Deuteronomy 3:11 tells us about the last known king of the Rephaim. Og, king of Bashan, was the last of the Rephites. His bed was decorated with iron and was more than 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. Let's put this in perspective. 9 cubits is approximately 13 feet long, and 4 cubits is about 6 feet wide. But beds are typically made longer than the person sleeping in them. So Og was probably around 11 to 12 feet tall and massively built, hence the need for an iron bed frame. No wooden bed could support his weight. The bed wasn't just functional, it was symbolic. Iron in the ancient world represented strength, warfare, and dominance. An iron bed was a statement of power. But there's another possibility that's even more intriguing. Some ancient cultures used iron in burial practices because they believed it prevented spirits from escaping their bodies after death. Could Og's iron bed have been designed not just for sleeping, but for some kind of spiritual protection? Given the Rephaim's connection to the realm of the dead, this isn't as far-fetched as it might sound. The geographical area associated with the Rephaim tells us even more about their nature. The Valley of Rephaim, located just southwest of Jerusalem, was named after these giants. But this wasn't just where they lived, it was where they were buried. Psalm 88:10 asks a haunting question. Do you show your wonders to the dead? Do the Rephaim rise up and praise you? The Hebrew text uses Rephaim as a synonym for the dead, suggesting these giants had become so associated with death that their name became a general term for departed spirits. Job 26:5 provides another clue. The dead are in deep anguish, those beneath the waters and all that live in them. Again, the Hebrew word for dead here is Rephaim. But notice the phrase, beneath the waters. This suggests the Rephaim had some connection to what ancient people called the waters under the earth, the underworld or realm of the dead. Isaiah 14:9 describes what happens in the realm of the dead. The realm of the dead below is all astir to meet you at your coming. It rouses the spirits of the departed to greet you, all those who were leaders in the world. The word translated as departed is again Rephaim. But here's where it gets really interesting. Isaiah 26:14 makes a distinction between regular dead people and the Rephaim. They are now dead. They live no more. Their spirits do not rise. You punished them and brought them to ruin. You wiped out all memory of them. This verse suggests that while normal humans have spirits that survive death, the Rephaim were different. Their destruction was more complete, more final. God didn't just kill their bodies, He eliminated their spiritual existence entirely. Why would God take such extreme measures against the Rephaim specifically? What made them different from other giant races? The answer might lie in their apparent ability to communicate with or influence the realm of the dead. If the Rephaim had developed supernatural abilities to interact with departed spirits, they would represent a particularly dangerous form of spiritual corruption. Ancient Near Eastern texts describe giants who served as intermediaries between the living and the dead. They were portrayed as having 1 foot in the physical world and 1 foot in the spiritual realm. This would make them incredibly dangerous from a biblical perspective, as it would represent a violation of the boundaries God established between life and death. Deuteronomy 18:10-12 specifically prohibits attempting to communicate with the dead. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritist, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. If the Rephaim were giants who specialized in necromancy and spirit communication, it would explain why God commanded their complete destruction and why their very name became synonymous with the realm of the dead. But the Rephaim weren't the only giant race that had to be eliminated before Israel could inherit the Promised Land. East of the Jordan River lived two more giant races whose very names struck terror into the hearts of everyone who heard them. Before we continue, I want to pause and ask you something. How many people in your church know about the Rephaim? How many pastors have preached about giants who were connected to the realm of the dead? If this information is new to you, imagine how eye-opening it would be for your friends and family. Take a moment to share this video. They need to hear this truth. The giants we're about to meet next were so terrifying that entire nations were afraid to even speak their real names. Chapter 6. Eastern Giants, the Emim and Zamzummim. East of the Jordan River, in territories that would later become the nations of Moab and Ammon, lived two giant races so terrifying that the local populations couldn't even bring themselves to use their real names. The first were called the Emim, but that wasn't their original name. Deuteronomy 2:10-11 explains, "The Emim used to live there, a people strong and numerous, and as tall as the Anakites. Like the Anakites, they too were considered Rephaim, but the Moabites called them Emim. The word Emim means terrors or fearful ones. These giants were so frightening that the Moabites couldn't bear to speak their actual name. Instead, they called them the Terrors, a name that described the effect these beings had on everyone who encountered them. Think about what this means. The Moabites were not weak people. They were descendants of Lot, who had established a strong kingdom east of the Dead Sea. They were experienced warriors who had conquered territory and built fortified cities. Yet when they talked about these giants, they were so afraid that they used a euphemism rather than their real name. What made the Emim so terrifying? The text tells us they were strong and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. We've already established that the Anakites were massive, tall enough to make grown men feel like grasshoppers. The Emim were just as large, but they had something the Anakites apparently lacked: vast numbers. The Anakim were organized into clans centered around specific cities, but the Emim were described as numerous, suggesting they had spread across a much wider territory and had a much larger population. Imagine facing not just a few giant warriors, but entire armies of beings 10 to 15 feet tall. But the Emim weren't the only giant race in the eastern territories. The Zamzummim lived in what became the territory of Ammon. Deuteronomy 2:20-21 describes them. That too was considered a land of the Rephaim, who used to live there, but the Ammonites called them Zamzummites. They were a people strong and numerous, and as tall as the Anakites. But the Lord destroyed them from before the Ammonites, who drove them out and settled in their place. Again, notice that Zamzummim wasn't their real name. The Ammonites were so afraid of these giants that they created a nickname for them. The word Zamzummim means plotters, schemers, or whisperers. This suggests these giants weren't just physically intimidating, they were intelligent, cunning, and strategic. The name Zamzummim comes from a Hebrew root that means to devise or to plan mischief. These weren't dumb brutes who relied only on their size and strength. They were strategic thinkers who could plan complex operations and coordinate attacks. This intelligence made them even more dangerous than other giant races. A 15-foot-tall warrior who fights with pure aggression is terrifying. But a 15-foot-tall warrior who can develop sophisticated battle plans and coordinate with other giants is absolutely devastating. Both the Emim and the Zamzummim were classified as Rephaim, connecting them to the same category as the death-associated giants we discussed earlier. This suggests all these giant races shared certain characteristics: supernatural size, spiritual corruption, and opposition to God's purposes. But here's what's remarkable about these eastern giant races. God didn't use Israel to destroy them. Instead, He helped the Moabites and Ammonites eliminate these giants before Israel even entered the region. Deuteronomy 2:21 specifically states that the Lord destroyed them from before the Ammonites. This wasn't just natural warfare between human tribes. God actively intervened to help eliminate these giant populations. Why would God help pagan nations destroy giants? Because these beings represented a threat to His entire plan for humanity. They weren't just enemies of Israel, they were enemies of the human race itself. Remember, God's promise to Abraham included blessing all nations through his descendants. If giant races continued to exist and multiply, they could potentially corrupt or destroy the human populations God intended to bless through Abraham's lineage. By helping the Moabites and Ammonites eliminate the Emim and Zamzummim, God was protecting the integrity of human genetics and clearing the way for His redemption plan to proceed. But this raises an important question. If God was systematically helping various nations eliminate giant races, why did some giants survive into Israel's time? Why were the Anakim still around when Joshua conquered Canaan? Why did Goliath and his family become such a problem for Israel centuries later? The answer reveals something crucial about God's methods and timing. God didn't eliminate all giants at once through supernatural intervention. Instead, He chose to use the conquest of Canaan as a test of Israel's faith and obedience. The surviving giant races became a proving ground for God's people. Would they trust Him enough to face seemingly impossible odds? Would they obey His commands, even when facing enemies that terrified experienced warriors? This is why the story of David and Goliath is so much more than just a tale about a brave shepherd boy. It's about God's people finally rising to the challenge and trusting their God to overcome supernatural opposition. But before we get to Goliath, we need to understand something crucial. He wasn't just one isolated giant. He came from a family of giants, and his family history connects directly to the ancient races we've been studying. If you're realizing that the Bible contains far more supernatural content than you ever imagined, you're not alone. Make sure to like this video and let me know in the comments what surprises you most about these biblical accounts of giants. The family tree we're about to explore will show you that the giant problem was far from over when Israel entered the Promised Land. Chapter 7. Goliath's Family, the Last Giant Dynasty. Everyone knows the story of David and Goliath, but what most people don't realize is that Goliath wasn't a lone giant warrior. He came from an entire family of giants, and after David killed him, Israel had to continue fighting his relatives for years. 1 Samuel 17:4 introduces Goliath as a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath. The word champion here is the Hebrew word Ish-Habanayim, which literally means man of the between spaces, or man who stands in the gap between armies. This wasn't just a description of his role as a representative fighter. It was a title that implied supernatural origin and power. But the most important detail in this introduction is that Goliath was from Gath. Remember from our earlier discussion that Gath was one of 3 Philistine cities where surviving Anakim took refuge after Joshua's conquest. This wasn't a coincidence. Gath had become a stronghold for giant bloodlines that had escaped Israel's initial conquest. 2 Samuel 21 reveals the shocking truth about Goliath's family. In the course of time, there was another battle with the Philistines at Gob. At that time, Sibbecai the Hushathite killed Saph, one of the descendants of Rapha. Rapha. That name should sound familiar. It's directly connected to the Rephaim, the giant race associated with death that we studied earlier. Goliath's family line traced back to the same giants who were known for their connection to the realm of the dead. The text continues. In another battle with the Philistines at Gob, Elhanan, son of Jair the Bethlehemite, killed the brother of Goliath the Gittite, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. Goliath had at least one brother who was also a giant warrior, but the family tree gets even more interesting. 2 Samuel 21:20 describes another family member. In still another battle, which took place at Gath, there was a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He also was descended from Rapha. 6 fingers and 6 toes. This wasn't just a random birth defect. It was a genetic marker that appeared consistently in giant bloodlines. 1 Chronicles 26 gives us additional details about this 6-fingered giant. In still another battle, which took place at Gath, there was a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He also was descended from Rapha. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan, son of Shemaiah, David's brother, killed him. This genetic marker tells us something crucial about giant inheritance. The trait of polydactyly, extra fingers and toes, was being passed down through giant family lines. This suggests that whatever caused the giant characteristics was genetic rather than purely supernatural. But here's what's truly remarkable. Modern genetic research has shown that polydactyly is indeed a heritable trait that can skip generations and then reappear. If ancient giant bloodlines carried this genetic marker, it could potentially surface in descendants thousands of years later. 2 Samuel 21:22 summarizes what happened to Goliath's family. These 4 were descendants of Rapha in Gath. and they fell at the hands of David and his men. 4 giants from the same family, 4 battles, 4 victories for David's forces. But notice that the text says these 4 were descendants of Rapha. This implies there might have been others who weren't mentioned in this particular account. The fact that all these battles took place over a period of years suggests that Goliath's family wasn't just randomly fighting Israel. They were systematically challenging God's people, possibly seeking revenge for Goliath's death. But there's another possibility that's even more intriguing. What if these giants weren't just seeking revenge? What if they were fulfilling some kind of spiritual mandate to oppose God's chosen people? Remember, these giants were descended from Rapha, connecting them to the Rephaim, who were associated with the realm of the dead. Could there have been a spiritual dimension to their opposition that went beyond mere human warfare? The location of these battles is also significant. Several took place at Gob and others at Gath itself. Gath wasn't just where Goliath lived. Archaeological evidence suggests it was designed to accommodate much larger inhabitants than normal humans. Excavations at Tel Es-Safi, the likely location of ancient Gath, have revealed massive foundations, oversized architectural features, and cultural artifacts that suggest inhabitants significantly larger than typical Bronze Age peoples. The city's walls, gates, and buildings all show evidence of construction designed for giants. But here's what makes the story of Goliath's family even more remarkable. David didn't fight all these giants himself. He was getting older, and the battles were fought by various members of his mighty men. Yet in every case, God gave Israel victory over these supernatural enemies. 1 Chronicles 28 provides the final summary. These were descendants of Rapha in Gath, and they fell at the hands of David and his men. With the death of Goliath's family, the last known giant dynasty in the Promised Land was eliminated. The bloodlines that had terrorized God's people for centuries were finally cut off. The supernatural opposition that had challenged Israel since the time of Moses was defeated. Or was it? The truth is, while David eliminated the giant families in Philistine territory, we can't be certain that all giant bloodlines were completely extinct. Ancient genetic material could have survived in recessive form, waiting for the right conditions to resurface. Modern archaeological discoveries have revealed evidence of unusually large human remains in various parts of the world. Some of these findings challenge our understanding of ancient human populations and raise questions about what we might have missed in the historical record. But before we explore the possibility that giant bloodlines might still exist today, we need to examine what archaeology has revealed about the giants mentioned in the Bible. The evidence is more extensive than most people realize, and some of the discoveries will absolutely shock you. If you're enjoying this journey through biblical mysteries, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. We're about to explore archaeological evidence that confirms much of what we've learned tonight, and you won't want to miss these incredible discoveries. Chapter 8: Archaeological Evidence: Giants in the Modern World. In 1950, archaeologists working in Jordan made a discovery that would challenge everything mainstream science believed about ancient human populations. They uncovered skeletal remains of individuals who stood between 8 and 12 feet tall, with bone structure unlike anything in the modern human population. These weren't isolated finds. Similar discoveries have been reported from excavations in Israel, Turkey, Peru, and the American Southwest. Each time, the evidence is carefully documented, measured, and photographed, only to disappear into private collections or storage facilities where the public never sees it again. Why? Because these discoveries don't fit the accepted narrative of human evolution and development. They suggest there were populations of genuinely giant humans living in the ancient world, exactly as the Bible describes. Let's start with the most well-documented evidence from the Holy Land itself. Excavations at Tel Es-Safi, the biblical city of Gath, have revealed architectural features that strongly suggest inhabitants much larger than normal humans. Dr. Aaron Meir, who leads the Tel Es-Safi excavation project, has uncovered massive stone foundations, oversized doorways, and architectural elements designed for people significantly taller and stronger than typical Bronze Age populations. While Dr. Meir doesn't claim these prove the existence of biblical giants, the evidence is consistent with what we would expect to find in a city inhabited by the Anakim. In 2005, archaeologists working in Turkey discovered a massive underground city called Derinkuyu. While the main chambers are sized for normal humans, some of the deeper levels contain passages and rooms with ceiling heights of 12 to 15 feet. Local legends speak of giants who once lived in these underground complexes. But perhaps the most intriguing evidence comes from ancient texts and inscriptions that describe encounters with giant peoples. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II left detailed records of battles against people he called the Sea Peoples, describing some of them as giants who stood as tall as cedar trees. Assyrian king Sargon II recorded military campaigns against populations he described as giants who dwelt in the mountains. His inscriptions provide specific measurements and describe weapons and armor designed for men twice the height of normal warriors. In Peru, the Nazca Lines region has yielded numerous elongated skulls and skeletal remains of individuals who would have stood 9 to 10 feet tall. Carbon dating places these remains at approximately 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, consistent with the biblical timeline for giant populations. The Smithsonian Institution has been accused of systematically suppressing evidence of giant human remains discovered throughout North America. Newspaper accounts from the late 1800s and early 1900s regularly reported discoveries of 7 to 12 foot tall skeletons with unusual skull shapes and dental structures. A 1912 article in the New York Times reported the discovery of skeletal remains near Lake Delavan, Wisconsin, of individuals ranging from 8 to 10 feet in height. The skulls showed evidence of double rows of teeth and unusually large eye sockets. The remains were reportedly sent to the Smithsonian for further study and were never seen again. Similar reports come from Ohio, where the Serpent Mound and other earthwork sites have yielded oversized skeletal remains. Local Native American tribes maintain oral traditions about a race of giants who once lived in the region and were eventually driven out or destroyed in warfare. But it's not just skeletal remains that provide evidence. Ancient megalithic structures around the world suggest construction by people with capabilities far beyond what we assume for ancient civilizations. The stone blocks at Baalbek in Lebanon weigh over 800 tons each. Modern cranes struggle to lift such weights, yet these blocks were quarried, transported, and precisely positioned thousands of years ago. Local legends attribute the construction to a race of giants who served as builders for the gods. The walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru consist of stones weighing up to 200 tons, fitted together so precisely that you can't slide a knife blade between them. Inca oral traditions speak of giants who built these structures in a single night, using techniques lost to history. Easter Island's Moai statues average 13 feet in height and weigh 14 tons each. But the local Rapa Nui people have legends about much larger statues that once existed, created by giants who could walk across the ocean floor. In the American Southwest, Hopi and Navajo traditions speak of a race of red-haired giants called the Siteka, who once dominated the region. In 1911, miners discovered mummified remains in Lovelock Cave, Nevada, of red-haired individuals measuring 8 to 10 feet tall. The remains showed evidence of violent death, consistent with Native American accounts of warfare against the giants. DNA analysis of ancient skeletal remains has revealed genetic anomalies that don't match any known human population. Some samples show genetic markers that appear to be hybrid combinations of different species, exactly what we might expect if the biblical account of angelic human interbreeding is accurate. In 2010, scientists analyzing DNA from 40,000-year-old Neanderthal remains discovered genetic sequences that don't match any known species. The researchers described the findings as evidence of unknown human ancestors with characteristics unlike anything in the modern human gene pool. More recently, the discovery of Denisovan DNA has revealed evidence of ancient human populations with genetic characteristics that seem almost supernatural. Denisovans appear to have possessed enhanced physical capabilities, increased brain capacity, and genetic traits that allowed them to survive in environments hostile to modern humans. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from the Bible itself. The detailed descriptions of giant races, their territories, their cities, and their elimination by various armies are remarkably consistent with archaeological and historical evidence from the ancient Near East. The Bible's account of giants isn't mythological or symbolic. It's historical reporting that matches what we find when we dig into the actual archaeological record. However, mainstream archaeology continues to resist acknowledging the implications of these discoveries. The academic establishment has too much invested in evolutionary theories that can't accommodate evidence of giant human populations with possibly supernatural origins. But the evidence continues to accumulate. New discoveries are made regularly, and while they're often suppressed or ignored by mainstream media, the truth is becoming harder to hide. The question we need to ask ourselves is this: If the Bible's account of ancient giants is supported by archaeological evidence, what does that tell us about the other supernatural claims in Scripture? If giants were real, if they had supernatural origins, if they represented a direct threat to God's plan for humanity, then we need to take seriously the biblical warnings about their possible return in the last days. Before we explore those prophecies, we need to understand how the giant bloodlines managed to survive and regroup after each attempt to eliminate them. The answer lies in their connection to the Philistine cities and their strategy for long-term survival. If these archaeological discoveries are new to you, please share this video with someone who needs to see this evidence. The truth about biblical giants is too important to keep hidden. Chapter 9. The Philistine Connection. Cities built for giants. The Philistines weren't originally giants, but they became the protectors and preservers of giant bloodlines that survived Israel's conquest of Canaan. Understanding this relationship is crucial for grasping how giant races managed to survive and continue threatening God's people for centuries after they should have been extinct. Joshua 11:22 provides the key information. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, GATH, and Ashdod did any survive. These three cities, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, were all major Philistine strongholds. The surviving Anakim didn't just happen to end up there by accident. They were deliberately given refuge and protection. Why would the Philistines harbor these giant populations? The answer reveals a sophisticated long-term strategy that nearly succeeded in preventing God's plan for Israel. The Philistines understood something that many ancient peoples missed. Giants weren't just unusually large humans. They were strategically valuable military assets, with capabilities that normal armies couldn't match. A single giant warrior could potentially turn the tide of an entire battle. But the Philistines also recognized that giants had a critical weakness. They were relatively few in number. While individual giants were incredibly powerful, giant populations were always smaller than normal human populations. They reproduced more slowly, had higher infant mortality rates, and required enormous amounts of resources to maintain. So the Philistines developed a symbiotic relationship with the surviving giant clans. They provided cities designed to accommodate giants, supplied the massive quantities of food and materials giants required, and offered protection from Israel's armies. In return, the giants served as the Philistines' ultimate weapon against their enemies. Archaeological evidence from Philistine cities confirms this arrangement. Excavations at Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod have all revealed architectural features designed for inhabitants much larger than typical Bronze Age humans. At Gath specifically, archaeologists have uncovered doorways 12 to 15 feet high, stairways with steps twice the normal height, foundation stones weighing several tons each, cooking facilities designed for preparing enormous quantities of food, weapons and armor sized for warriors, 10 to 12 feet tall. These weren't modifications made to accommodate occasional giant visitors. These were cities designed from the ground up with giant inhabitants in mind. But the Philistine strategy went beyond simply providing sanctuary. They actively worked to preserve and expand giant bloodlines through careful breeding programs and genetic management. Ancient texts describe Philistine priests who maintained detailed genealogical records of giant families. They arranged marriages between giant clans to preserve desirable traits. They provided medical care to increase giant survival rates. They even established schools to train young giants in warfare and military strategy. This wasn't just about creating bigger soldiers. The Philistines understood that giants represented something supernatural that could potentially defeat Israel's God. They were essentially preserving and cultivating a supernatural weapon system. The strategy nearly worked. For over 400 years, from the time of Joshua until the reign of David, giant warriors from Philistine cities repeatedly challenged Israel. They defeated Israelite armies, killed Israelite leaders, and came close to completely destroying God's chosen people on multiple occasions. Goliath's challenge to Israel wasn't just personal bravado. It was the culmination of centuries of Philistine investment in giant warfare capabilities. When Goliath stepped onto the battlefield, he represented the Philistines' ultimate answer to Israel's supernatural advantages. Think about the timing. David had just been anointed as Israel's future king. Saul's reign was faltering. Israel was at a critical point in their history where defeat could have ended their existence as a nation. The Philistines chose this moment to deploy their most powerful weapon. But there's something even more significant about Goliath's challenge. 1 Samuel 17:8-9 records his exact words. "Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." This wasn't just a military challenge. It was a spiritual test. Goliath was essentially challenging Israel's God to prove his power through single combat. The giant was betting that supernatural size and strength would overcome divine protection. From the Philistines' perspective, this made perfect sense. Their giant warriors had supernatural origins. They possessed abilities that normal humans couldn't match. If Israel's God was real and powerful, let him prove it by enabling a normal human to defeat a supernatural opponent. David's victory shattered more than just Goliath's skull. It broke the Philistines' confidence in their giant weapon system. It demonstrated that God's power was greater than supernatural size and strength. It marked the beginning of the end for giant bloodlines in the Promised Land. But the Philistines didn't give up immediately. They continued deploying giant warriors from Goliath's family for years after his death. Each time, God gave Israel victory, but the battles were fierce and dangerous. The final elimination of Goliath's family marked the end of an era. The last organized giant bloodlines in the biblical narrative had been defeated. The supernatural opposition that had challenged God's people for over a millennium was finally overcome. However, this raises an important question. Were these really the last giants? Did the elimination of Goliath's family mean that all giant bloodlines were extinct forever? The Bible suggests otherwise. The New Testament contains references to giants that most Christians have never noticed. Hidden in Greek translations and genealogical records, that seem unrelated to the Old Testament accounts. But before we explore those hidden references, let me ask you something. How has this information changed your understanding of biblical history? Drop a comment below and let me know what surprises you most about the Philistine giant connection. And if you think someone else needs to hear this, hit that share button right now. The New Testament evidence we're about to examine will show you that the giant story didn't end with David's victories. Chapter 10, New Testament. Giants, hidden in plain sight. Most Christians read the New Testament without realizing it contains multiple references to giants, but these references are hidden in Greek translations, genealogical records, and prophetic passages that seem unrelated to the Old Testament giant accounts. Let's start with the most obvious reference that most people miss. Matthew 1:5 mentions Rahab in Jesus' genealogy, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Most Christians know Rahab as the prostitute who helped the Israelite spies in Jericho, but few realize the implications of her inclusion in Christ's family line. Jericho was one of the primary Canaanite cities inhabited by giant races. Joshua 2:1 tells us the spies went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. But why would Israelite spies choose to stay with a prostitute? The answer might be more strategic than moral. Rahab lived in a house built into Jericho's wall. Archaeological evidence suggests Jericho's walls were designed to accommodate inhabitants much larger than normal humans. The city's architecture, like other Canaanite strongholds, shows signs of giant occupation. Ancient Jewish commentaries suggest Rahab herself may have had giant ancestry. Her name in Hebrew means broad or wide, possibly referring to unusual physical characteristics. Her house's location in the wall suggests she had high status in the city, unusual for a prostitute unless she had some other source of importance. If Rahab had giant bloodline connections, her conversion to faith in Israel's God becomes even more significant. It would represent the redemption of giant genetics into God's plan for humanity, ultimately contributing to the Messiah's human lineage. But the most direct New Testament reference to giants comes from Jesus himself. In Matthew 11:23, Jesus mentions Sodom and Gomorrah. "And you, Capernaum, will you be lifted to the heavens? No, you will go down to Hades. For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Sodom, it would have remained to this day." Why is this significant? Because ancient Jewish texts, including some that were available during Jesus' time, describe Sodom and Gomorrah as cities inhabited by giants. The book of Jasher, which the Bible references twice, Joshua 10:13 and 2 Samuel 1:18, provides detailed accounts of giant populations in these cities. According to Jasher, the men of Sodom were extraordinarily large and violent. When the angels came to destroy the city, the men who surrounded Lot's house weren't just morally corrupt. They were physically imposing giants who thought they could overpower divine messengers. This adds new meaning to Genesis 19:4. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. The Hebrew text suggests these weren't normal-sized men. They were described using terms that elsewhere refer to giants and mighty warriors. Jude verse 6 provides another crucial reference. And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day. This verse directly references the same event described in Genesis 6 that created the original Nephilim. But Jude writes about it as if it was still relevant to first-century Christians. Why would he warn about something that happened before the flood, unless similar events were still possible? 2 Peter 2:4 confirms this interpretation. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. The Greek word translated as hell here is Tartarus, a specific place in Greek mythology reserved for the worst supernatural criminals. Both Peter and Jude write about these fallen angels in present tense, suggesting their influence was still affecting the world during New Testament times. They weren't just discussing ancient history, they were warning about ongoing spiritual warfare connected to the original giant-creating rebellion. But perhaps the most intriguing New Testament reference appears in Revelation 9:7-11, describing demonic beings that emerge during the end times. The locusts looked like horses prepared for battle. On their heads, they wore something like crowns of gold, and their faces resembled human faces. Their hair was like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. They had breastplates, like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the thundering of many horses and chariots rushing into battle. They had tails with stingers, like scorpions, and in their tails they had power to torment people for 5 months. They had as king over them the angel of the abyss, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek is Apollyon, that is, destroyer. These beings have human faces, but supernatural characteristics. They're led by a fallen angel, whose name means destroyer. Some biblical scholars believe these are the same demonic entities that created the original Nephilim, finally released from their prison to torment humanity in the last days. The description of iron breastplates is particularly interesting. Remember that Og, the last king of the Rephaim, had an iron bed. Iron was associated with giant bloodlines and supernatural warfare throughout the Old Testament. But the most significant New Testament reference might be Jesus' own words about the end times. Matthew 24:37 records his prophecy. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. What made Noah's time unique? Genesis 6 tells us it was when fallen angels corrupted human genetics by creating the Nephilim. If the end times will be as it was in the days of Noah, then genetic corruption and supernatural interference in human DNA should be key features of the last days. Today, we're witnessing unprecedented advances in genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology. Scientists are manipulating human DNA, creating hybrid organisms, and pushing the boundaries of what it means to be human. Could we be approaching the same level of genetic manipulation that existed before the flood? Revelation 16:14 mentions spirits of demons performing signs that deceive the kings of the earth. These aren't normal demonic influences. They're supernatural beings capable of miraculous signs that fool even world leaders. The Greek word for signs here is semeion, which refers to supernatural demonstrations of power designed to prove divine authority. If demons can perform convincing miracles in the end times, they might be the same entities that originally created the Nephilim through supernatural breeding programs. 2 Thessalonians 2:9-11 warns about the coming of the lawless one, who will arrive with all kinds of false miracles, signs and wonders, and will be accompanied by a strong delusion that deceives even God's chosen people. Could this delusion involve the return of giant bloodlines? Could it include genetic manipulation that creates a race of beings that aren't fully human? Could the supernatural opposition that challenged God's people throughout biblical history be preparing for one final assault? The New Testament evidence suggests the giant story isn't over. The same spiritual forces that created the original Nephilim are still active, still working to corrupt God's creation, and still preparing for a final confrontation with the Almighty. But if that's true, if giants are returning in the last days, what should God's people expect? How should we prepare for the possibility that supernatural opposition is about to reach levels not seen since the days of Noah? The prophetic implications of giant return are both terrifying and hopeful, depending on which side you're on. If you want to understand what the Bible really says about the future, you need to subscribe and turn on notifications. The final chapter of this giant story is still being written. Chapter 11: The Return of the Nephilim, End Times. Prophecy. Jesus made a startling prophecy that most Christians read without understanding its full implications. Matthew 24:37 records his words, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." What exactly characterized Noah's days? Genesis 6:1-4 provides the answer. Fallen angels corrupted human genetics by interbreeding with human women, creating a race of giants called Nephilim, who filled the earth with violence and corruption. If the end times will truly be as it was in the days of Noah, then we should expect to see genetic corruption, supernatural interference in human DNA, and possibly the return of giant bloodlines before Christ's second coming. Are we seeing signs of this today? Consider the unprecedented advances in genetic engineering happening right now. Scientists are manipulating human DNA, creating hybrid organisms, and pushing the boundaries of what it means to be human. CRISPR technology allows precise genetic editing that would have been pure science fiction just decades ago. Researchers are experimenting with human-animal hybrids, growing human organs in animals, and creating genetically modified humans with enhanced capabilities. Some experiments involve inserting animal DNA into human genomes to create beings with superhuman strength, intelligence, or sensory abilities. But it's not just genetic manipulation that parallels Noah's time. Ancient texts describe the pre-flood world as technologically advanced, with knowledge that came from fallen angels rather than human discovery. The Book of Enoch claims fallen angels taught humans astronomy, metallurgy, warfare, and other sciences that led to rapid technological development. Today, we're experiencing the fastest technological advancement in human history. Artificial intelligence is approaching levels that seem almost supernatural. Quantum computing is solving problems that would take normal computers millions of years. Scientists are talking seriously about achieving immortality through technology. Where is this knowledge coming from? How are we suddenly capable of things that would have seemed like magic to previous generations? Revelation 16:14 describes spirits of demons performing signs in the end times. The Greek word for signs refers to supernatural demonstrations of power designed to prove divine authority. Could some of our technological breakthroughs actually be supernatural knowledge being revealed by the same fallen angels who corrupted the pre-flood world? But genetic manipulation isn't the only parallel to Noah's time. Genesis 6:11 says the earth was filled with violence because of the Nephilim. Today, we're seeing levels of violence, moral corruption, and social chaos that mirror the pre-flood conditions. The Bible suggests this isn't coincidental. 2 Timothy 3:1-5 warns that, in the last days, terrible times will come, characterized by people who are lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. This description matches exactly what Genesis says about the pre-flood world. A society so corrupted by supernatural influence that every thought and intention was evil continuously. But the most significant parallel might be the increasing reports of supernatural encounters around the world. People are claiming to see strange beings, experiencing unexplained phenomena, and encountering entities that don't seem entirely human. UFO sightings have increased dramatically in recent years. Government agencies are acknowledging the existence of unidentified aerial phenomena that demonstrate technology beyond current human capabilities. Some researchers suggest these encounters might not involve aliens from other planets, but interdimensional beings, the same fallen angels that created the original Nephilim. Dr. Jacques Vallée, a respected UFO researcher, has argued that the modern UFO phenomenon parallels historical accounts of demonic encounters. The beings reported in UFO encounters often display characteristics consistent with fallen angels: supernatural knowledge, shape-shifting abilities, and a consistent message that contradicts biblical truth. Could the alien phenomenon actually be preparing humanity for the return of the Nephilim? Could these encounters be conditioning people to accept genetic manipulation and hybrid beings as normal or even beneficial? Revelation 9:1-11 describes beings that emerge from the abyss during the end times tribulation. These creatures have human faces but supernatural characteristics, are led by a fallen angel named Destroyer, and torment humanity for 5 months. The description suggests These aren't entirely spiritual beings. They have physical characteristics that can be observed and described. Could these be Nephilim-type hybrids that have been preserved in some supernatural prison, waiting to be released during the final judgment? Daniel 2:43 contains a prophecy that's often overlooked. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united, any more than iron mixes with clay. Some biblical scholars interpret this as referring to genetic mixing in the end times, possibly human DNA being corrupted by non-human genetic material, just as happened before the flood. But here's what's both terrifying and hopeful about these prophecies. They also describe God's ultimate victory over these supernatural forces. Revelation 19:19-21 depicts the final battle. Then I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to wage war against the rider on the horse and his army. But the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet who had performed the signs on its behalf. The two of them were thrown alive into the fiery lake of burning sulfur. The rest were killed with the sword coming out of the mouth of the rider on the horse. Whatever supernatural opposition emerges in the end times, whether it's returning Nephilim, genetically modified humans, or fallen angels masquerading as aliens, they will be completely defeated by Christ at his second coming. The same God who destroyed the original Nephilim with the flood, who helped Israel eliminate the giant races in Canaan, who gave David victory over Goliath, will win the final battle against supernatural rebellion. This gives us hope, but it also gives us responsibility. If we're living in the last days, if genetic corruption is returning, if supernatural deception is increasing, then God's people need to be prepared spiritually for challenges unlike anything the church has faced in recent history. We need to understand biblical truth about the supernatural realm. We need to recognize deception when we see it. We need to maintain our faith in God's ultimate victory, even when facing seemingly impossible opposition. But most importantly, we need to remember that throughout biblical history, giants have always represented the same thing: rebellion against God's natural order and opposition to his plan for humanity. No matter how large they become, how advanced their technology, or how supernatural their abilities, they cannot stand against the Almighty. God always wins. His people always prevail. The giants always fall. If you're concerned about what's coming, if you want to be prepared for the challenges ahead, make sure you're subscribed and sharing this information with others. The final chapter of human history is being written, and God's people need to understand what's really happening. But before we conclude tonight's journey, I want to leave you with the most important truth of all: hope. Chapter 12. The final victory. Hope for God's people. Throughout this journey, we've explored terrifying accounts of supernatural giants who opposed God's people for thousands of years. We've examined archaeological evidence, ancient texts, and biblical prophecies that suggest these beings might return in the end times. It would be easy to feel overwhelmed or afraid, but I want to end tonight with the most important truth in all of Scripture. God always wins. Every giant race we've studied, the Nephilim, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzumim, and Goliath's family, was eventually defeated and eliminated. Not one of them survived God's judgment. Not one of them successfully thwarted his plan for humanity. The flood destroyed the original Nephilim completely. Joshua eliminated the Anakim from the promised land. David and his men killed the last of Goliath's giant dynasty. In every case, no matter how large, how strong, or how numerous these supernatural enemies became, they fell before God's power. This pattern teaches us something crucial about spiritual warfare. The outcome is never in doubt. God doesn't win because he's stronger than his enemies. He wins because he's the creator and they're merely rebellious creatures. The contest isn't even close. When David faced Goliath, he didn't win because he was a better warrior. He won because he trusted in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. 1 Samuel 17:45. David understood something the giant didn't. Size and strength mean nothing when you're fighting against the God who created the universe. This same principle applies to whatever supernatural challenges we might face in our time. If giants return, if genetic corruption increases, if fallen angels attempt another rebellion, the outcome is already determined. God will win, his people will be victorious, and his enemies will be utterly defeated. Revelation 20:7-10 describes the final rebellion against God. When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and to gather them for battle. In number, they are like the sand on the seashore. They marched across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of God's people, the city he loves. But fire came down from heaven and devoured them, and the devil, who deceived them, was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown. They will be tormented day and night, forever and ever. Notice what happens in this final battle. Satan gathers armies as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They surround God's people and appear to have overwhelming advantage. But God doesn't even need to fight them. Fire simply comes down from heaven and devours them completely. This is how every supernatural rebellion ends, with total defeat for God's enemies and complete victory for his people. But understanding this pattern gives us more than just confidence about the future. It transforms how we live today. When we truly grasp that God has already won every battle, we can face any challenge with faith instead of fear. 1 John 4:4 reminds us, "You, dear children, are from God and have overcome them, because the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world." The same God who defeated the Nephilim lives inside every believer. The same power that eliminated giant races is available to us today. This doesn't mean we'll never face difficulties or supernatural opposition. The Bible clearly warns about increasing deception and tribulation in the end times. But it does mean we can face whatever comes with absolute confidence in the outcome. When the Israelite spies saw the Anakim and felt like grasshoppers, they forgot who their God was. When Joshua and Caleb saw the same giants, they remembered God's promises and maintained their faith. The giants hadn't changed, but their perspective on God's power made all the difference. Today, we're surrounded by challenges that seem impossible to overcome. Moral corruption appears to be winning. Technology is advancing faster than our ability to control it. Genetic manipulation threatens the very definition of humanity. But none of these challenges are beyond God's power to resolve. The key is maintaining the perspective that Joshua and Caleb had. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. Numbers 14, 8-9. Whatever giants we face today, whether they're spiritual, technological, or even literal, their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. This confidence isn't based on our own strength, intelligence, or preparation. It's based on the character and promises of God Himself. He has never failed His people. He has never lost a battle. He has never broken a promise. The same God who walked with Enoch before the flood, who preserved Noah through the flood, who gave Abraham the promised land, who delivered Israel from Egypt, who helped them conquer Canaan, who gave David victory over Goliath, is our God today. He hasn't changed. His power hasn't diminished. His love for His people hasn't lessened. His commitment to His plan hasn't wavered. So as we face an uncertain future, as we watch for signs of the end times, as we prepare for whatever challenges may come, we can do so with hope instead of fear. We're not fighting for victory. We're fighting from victory that's already been won. Romans 8:37-39 declares, "No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through Him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation, will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." Notice that Paul specifically mentions angels and demons and powers as things that cannot separate us from God's love. Even if fallen angels return, even if supernatural giants reappear, even if we face opposition like the pre-flood world experienced, nothing can separate us from God's love and ultimate victory. The story of biblical giants isn't ultimately about giants at all. It's about God's faithfulness to His people despite impossible opposition. It's about His commitment to His plan despite supernatural interference. It's about His power being perfected in our weakness despite overwhelming odds. Tonight, you've learned truths that most Christians never discover. You've explored mysteries that have been hidden from the church for generations. You've gained understanding about spiritual warfare that will transform how you read your Bible and face your challenges. But the most important truth isn't what you've learned about giants. It's what you've discovered about God. He is faithful, He is powerful, He is victorious, and He is on your side. Whatever giants you're facing in your own life, whatever impossible circumstances you're confronting, whatever supernatural opposition you're encountering, remember this: God has already won. Your victory is assured. Your enemies will fall, The giants always fall. God always wins. His people always prevail. And that, my friend, is a truth worth sharing with everyone you know. Before you go, I want to ask you to do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss future explorations into biblical mysteries. Second, share this video with someone who needs to hear these truths. They're too important to keep to yourself. And third, let me know in the comments which part of this journey surprised you most. The hidden truths in God's Word are waiting to be discovered. The spiritual battles around us are waiting to be understood. The victories God has in store are waiting to be claimed. Your journey into biblical truth is just beginning. And trust me, the best is yet to come, yet to